real conversation. And you're all welcome to join in. I hope some of you got a chance to walk through the galleries and see Runo's show. So we're going to show some images from the show and also other projects that are related. And so we're starting with this work as it was installed in Italy. The West is everywhere you look. And I think this is a really great way to start the show. So as Jesse mentioned, my background is in Latin American art. And when I was thinking of what I wanted to do for my first concentrations show, I was thinking, should I do a Latin American artist? Should I not do a Latin American artist? I'm not a Latin American curator. I'm a curator of contemporary art. So I was thinking about how I could kind of translate my background to maybe pivot to things that were broader a bit. What I really love about thinking about Runo's work is that Runo was born in Sweden. He's lived many places, but mostly in Europe. And so I thought it was really interesting to think about how we can deal with similar issues through maybe more abstract or non-regional vocabularies. Sorry, I touched that. And so I think that's a really interesting kind of way it was an interesting way for me to kind of address some of the interests that I had that were more strongly kind of regionally based, but in a way that has kind of universal implications, because I think it's a way for us all to think about how we kind of our own place in these narratives. And Runo, maybe you can start by addressing West is Everywhere You Look, which is on view now in the show.
Thanks for coming, and I think also I'm very happy to be here and for the invitation for the museum. And also, as Katherine said, you're very much welcome to dialogue with us. So it doesn't have to be like that we talk and then there's like a 5 minutes questions by then. So if you have any questions or any remarks or any wondering, just feel free to ask, no? So we can kind of try to open the space a bit, no? I think, as Katherine said, for a long time, my work has been, I have been having a long, interesting question of geography, or like the way, the way we today reference maps, or the way we kind of, the way these things has been constructed, creating so many things in our everyday life or in our contemporary life, no? And this piece, no, that is also one of the pieces that are exhibited here in Dallas. What you see is there are these school maps. I don't know if they exist. I don't know if they're as common as they're in Sweden, but they're and for me, like school maps, they present in a way of the connection of the school to knowledge is of course very clear, no? Hopefully. But also there is also a connection between maps. When I was a kid, you saw these maps and you fantasize about places that you could perhaps go to, or places that you will not go to, but also borders and they create a fantasy, I think, no, in so many ways. But at the same time, maps are also constructions of exclusion, no, and borders and definitions. So in this work, I think that for me that's why I decided to censorship them in a way, no, or to roll them up. You don't see the content of the map, no. And what I think is also fascinating with the map is that even if you don't see the content, we are so trained to see how a map looks like that you still imagine it. You project how a map looks like, no? So I think that also creates, I hope, a thought in the viewer of what kind of maps I'm trained to see, no? Like what kind of maps I have been historically produced, no? I think that's an important aspect. So in that sense, that's why they're rolled, because they can play with this notion of exclusion and inclusion, no? At the same time, they're spinning very slowly. So I think for me that creates a possibility of some kind of subjects, like a bodily subject, but also a kind of an idea of that even if they spin, the idea of the West as a kind of not as a truth claim, but as a kind of like a hegemonic position, it's still a center. No? There is a definition that starts from the West, no? The West and the rest, no? As Stuart Hall will have called it. No? But so I think that has that. I think in that sense, that's why that they have this closure and at the spin. No?
I think that it's also, so I think there's two really interesting things about your work in terms of both form and content. And I love the idea of the very basic level of these maps being closed and bringing the idea that we know what a map looks like even without looking at it, is that it directly addresses what viewers bring to a work. So your work, it can be very abstracted and very like pared down, but there's this whole other level that we project into the work. And I think this is a really beautiful kind of poetic enactment of that. And again, the title, West is Everywhere You Look, is how much what we bring to this like has been socially conditioned and that we don't always question it. And the fact that West, of course, it's relative. There is no set West. And we're further west than Europe is. South America, which is often in art history talked about as non-Western art, is further west even on that map that's been politically diagrammed than Europe. So all of these things are relative and they're all in flux and they change over time. They're a reflection directly of power and whoever holds the power at one given time. So I think it's really interesting, especially as you said, the turning. So it's literally enacting that none of this is fixed, that it's actually moving on an axis and that there is no kind of fixed position through the space. It's a really beautiful, also I think, action to walk through them so you can actually see kind of bodily your own relationship kind of to them. And they have, of course, in their vertical alignment, a more kind of anthropomorphic quality to it as well as kind of an object.
I think also the way that they're placed, they become much more reference to a body compared to like the idea of maps being like vertical, like horizontal. I think that's also like an important and also the inclusion of the audience, not only in this kind of intellectual and kind of like discussion between the abstract and the political, but also the inclusion for the viewer as a body to be within the maps. No? So I think to be able to play with both those levels, I think it's like a central aspect.
I think that's a good segue to the next slide that I accidentally gave away earlier. So this is a work called Quinta Campos, which is a series of images that are projected through a slide projector. So these are photographs that you took at Ibirapuera Park in Sao Paulo. And I'll let you talk more about them in a minute, but again, we have this issue of the map, and this directly, I think, dialogues with some issues in the histories, kind of central issues in the history of Latin American kind of modern contemporary art, which has been very focused on the map and how to claim a position within art history based on a geographic position and how it does often kind of align so directly kind of with geography. But this was, I'm sure, I haven't really talked to you actually about this, with the experience of taking these photographs, which in a way is like a derive through the space, of course, kind of walking and seeing these. So these are sidewalk cracks.
You can,
so
if you flip.
Many of them. So these look like South America, but these are found kind of moments where the sidewalk cracks in Ibirapuera reflect the map of South America. And so here's the slide projector. So I first saw this work at the Guggenheim. It was in a really important group show of contemporary Latin American art called Under the Same Sun. And this is a map, kind of a bird's eye drawing of Ibirapuera by Oscar Niemeyer, he did this map, right? Why don't you talk about it, since you know more about it?
No, but I think like, at first I think like this piece, which is not in the show, but there is also an element in many of my work with this, there's a kind of element of performativity or like, which I think which has been very central for my work for the last years. And I think the idea of making a work, or like me as an artist move, or making a work move from one place to another, leaves these discussions of placement and displacement. No? But in this case, I think you can, if you go to the next two ones, this is a park which is called Parque Ibirapuera, no, in Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is this mega city which has very few public spaces, no? But this park was designed by Oscar Niemeyer and Bulo Marx, and in a way it's the canonical center of Latin American modernity. Like this is the most influential. Oscar Niemeyer is the most influential, one of the most influential architects of modernity in Latin America, or even not only, and this park became like the essence of that. So what this is what you see from here is the marquise. And the marquise, what it does, as Brazil is a tropical country, it protects people from rain or sun. And then on the different parts of after the marquise, you have the different cultural institutions. The most important one being the Sao Paulo Biennale Halle. So what I did, exactly. Yeah. So what I did, if you can send, I think the next one is you see this is how it looks like in everyday. So it's a very used marquise. Like people skate or people dance or people just have eat whatever, hang out. But so I was there as anybody else was there, and then I kind of saw that there were cracks in the pavement, and then I kind of had this idea of I will look for cracks that look like South America. So that's the slides that you showed before. So in a way, it was also this kind of not naive, but it was also this kind of fantasy of searching for South America in the canonical place of modernity. Like in a way also playing with the idea of that this modernity or this idea of South America was already so cracking down. Of course, it was like deteriorating, which has been much more clear many years after this work's been made. So also in the relation to the maps in the other work, it's not like I had a map of South America. It was also much more about my fantasy of this South America, of looking for South America. So then we walked through the park, or we walked through the whole marquise, searching for these cracks, for the cracks of South America.
Yeah, and just to give you a sense, if you don't know your Brazilian modernist history, so Niemeyer again was very much kind of the pinnacle of this idea of Brazilian modernity and writing a history almost from scratch. He designed from scratch, more famous than Ibirapuera probably, is Brasilia, which was the capital of Brazil after Rio, where they created from nothing, from the literal center of Brazil, capital ex nihilo. So nothing existed there, and he created from a bird's eye plain view what he wanted this kind of utopian city to look like. So it was very much this kind of tabula rasa, kind of inscription of modernity on the country. And now, of course, we see, like many countries at this time, there's a huge crisis in Brazil, and a lot of the things that are falling victim are this sense of culture, which at one time there was a very kind of optimistic kind of view of creating a culture from scratch, even though, of course, there was so much culture before it. And even that, the little cracks kind of in the infrastructure, I think, are showing very strongly now. So I think it has even more kind of a poetic resonance in kind of finding those cracks.
Yeah, I think so too. But also, I think also like one of the big discourse of modernity, not only the one of Oscar Niemeyer, but many other theories, is the idea of like a tabula rasa, that there didn't exist something before, or that at least nothing which was important. And I think that like much more critical scholars have shown like that there is a darker side of modernity, like for example like the colonial history of Brazil, and how the discourse of modernity, the idea of like how that produces like codes of like the idea of something being new, something that didn't exist before, and all of these things, like. Of course, they started to crack already when the modernity starts in Brazil in the 50s and 60s. But I think the last years that's been very evident, like that you find this cracks, and I think because in a way you don't play or you don't think about so much in relation to the history of your own continent.
And can you speak a little bit about the title and also the medium of this work?
The title is called Contra Tiempos, which means against time. I think it deals with the idea of like a time structure. And why I chose it to be like slides, which is kind of very like analog system, For me, I think it has to do with this idea of that it's a way of telling or a dialogue with the audience that there is a movement, no? That I walk through the park. And I think that as slides change, like materiality, you can in a way address that movement, which I think is very hard to do in a flat, like in a video, for example. That's, I think, the reason why you use slides. There's like there's a physicality and a materiality that clearly suggests movement and time.
Yeah, it's a really bodily experience of time too, and it makes you take your time. And it also, as we know, Elena, our lovely objects conservator, is here, and we're on a time-based media initiative where we're trying to save these medias. There are also things that have cracks and will show really like a material deterioration over time. So it's very, I think, performative in that way.
What year is this work from?
2010? I think it's 2010.
2010. Yeah, I think it is 2010, actually, yeah, probably. So it was like, so like I moved to Sao Paulo in 2009, so I think it was like the year after I produced this piece.
I think we have some slides of some other maps, famous Latin American maps. So this is Joaquin Torres Garcia's inverted map of South America, who is a very important Uruguayan artist who was born in Uruguay, started his career in Barcelona, then lived Madrid, Paris, New York, before returning to Uruguay, where he was really the founder of like kind of contemporary abstract Latin American art. And so he had already started working in a very abstract idiom after being a figurative painter in Barcelona, actually on the right wing, and then was very kind of, even though Uruguay has very few kind of remains of indigenous culture, was very excited by the idea of kind of the abstract shapes and say Machu Picchu or something that has an indigenous kind of relationship to it. So recreating the idea of abstraction through an indigenous Latin American vein. So he was very educated in Europe, very kind of fluent in kind of cosmopolitan language, but was specifically interested in kind of rewriting this history through something that was indigenous to Latin America. So he inverted the map of South America, and it's the idea of kind of flipping what's south and what's north, which I think is also something that you very, very literally kind of play with these ideas of inverting directions, which I think is super interesting. And then I just wanted to bring up this work because we own it now. I bought it in Buenos Aires and I love this work so much. So this is an Argentine artist, Horacio Zabala, to also kind of give this aspect of the context that directly affected your life, of course, is that Runo's parents immigrated from Argentina to Europe during the Dirty War in South America. So there was a very harsh dictatorship, military dictatorship in Buenos Aires that disappeared up to 30,000 people. Actually, it was very, very brutal. And there was kind of widespread censorship in Argentina. So I'm not sure how directly you respond to that or not in your work, but there is a really kind of beautiful tradition of conceptual art in Argentina that deals a lot with the map and with censorship. So this is a very light slide, so it's kind of hard to read. But Zabala here reproduces a map of South America in this kind of serial pattern that looks almost like minimalism, and this kind of, like serial changes to something that's very regular, but he stamps on it to revise, to censor, and then it becomes a black monochrome, so it's completely kind of voided out. So I think there's a really interesting kind of context in that way.
No, but also if you go to the Crucero del Norte, I don't know if you, maybe we can do this. Skip this one so you can go back. Sorry.
We're giving away everything.
Yes, this one. No, I mean, I think that as like this, there's this, like the idea of a place, no? I think for me, like, it became very clear, like when I started to cross the Atlantic, because I had families or like in different continents, the idea of the Atlantic as a space, not only something that you cross, but also that you experienced, became very important in my thinking and in different ways. No? And I think that, and like in a personal way, of course, that had a lot to do also with the the kind of the experience of being exiled. Like I'm born in Sweden, but my parents exiled, no? So so in that sense, like I experienced a non-experience exile, like in a psychoanalytical sense, no, I would say. But I think that that movement between these continents is something that I dealt in many ways, and I think this works. I think strongly relates to the work of Héctor, which is called this piece is called Crucero del Norte, and it's I can show it. It's actually, this piece is also exhibited here, no? In a different way, in a better way, I would say. And it's called Crucero del Norte. Crucero del Norte means the North Cruiser. It's called that because the bus company was called that. So what I like when my parents exiled from Argentina in '76, my father took a bus from Buenos Aires to Rio de Janeiro, because that was if you were not legally, like my father, of course they were not, they were searched by the military in Argentina, so taking the bus was the most secure way of escaping the country if you had like illegal documents, no? So he did that in '76, and he took the bus, and in Rio de Janeiro he met up with my mother and my sister that took the boat. So what I did, and then they went to Europe, they crossed the Atlantic. No? So what I did in these pieces, like some years ago, I reenacted the journey. Of course, I know that it's not, the stakes were of course so much lower because it's like I have a legal passport and none of the countries has a military regimes, no? But in a way I kind of reenacted my father's journey. So what I took the bus, which is like a 48-hour bus tour, no? From Buenos Aires to Rio de Janeiro. And when I arrived, as you see in you see here, I opened, I brought a case of black and white photographs, like in the box. So in a way I had this idea of, like in a way, like a material idea that they will carry, they will get this, they will be imprinted of this narrative, this journey, you know. And then when I arrived to Rio, I just opened the box and let the light enter the photo papers. In a way also, metaphorically speaking, saying that like the idea of light as some kind of position of freedom or hope, you know. So in that sense, I think this work is like very much related to like the kind of the Héctor, like or his work and that moment in like Latin American history, which is like the 70s and the productions of military regimes.
Yeah, I think it is really nice. We were discussing when we were installing it, how we install it now. You kind of look at each photograph in succession, and the fact that it creates kind of a journey in a similar way. I think what's been really fun about installing the work is seeing how those spatial relationships kind of enact themselves as you're moving through the gallery, which I think is really lovely. So this is also stamped work, so this is kind of a nice transition from this too, which I didn't realize, which Zabala used a lot of stamps. And so this is a previous iteration of American Amnesia, which is on the back wall of one of our galleries. So this is all hand stamped. 2 stamps that say American Amnesia, so of course it's this play on words. And maybe you could talk a little bit about your inspiration to this work.
Man, I think so. You'd like to so you understand. It's like it's 2 stamps, no. So you have to stamp America, and then the I in America and the I in Amnesia, they're superimposed, no, creating this kind of endless narrative of America Amnesia, no. I think that there is. I think for me there is 2 like inspirational structures, or no. One is the idea of like for me like the amnesia of South America, no? Its own constantly non-engagement, and it's totally erasing its own history, no? Like it's like especially very clearly its own native history, but also, like in my case, I think also so clearly the struggles of don't erasing the history of like the dirty war of Argentina, for example, is also very central in so many struggles. But also there is also the other way, which is in the idea of America not being the U.S. No? Like very commonly we refer to U.S. as America, but for the rest of the Americas, U.S. is one country, America is many, many countries. No? So I think in that way, I think I wanted to have these both structures, no? To play with both those analogies.
And I think we lost the Alfredo Yar slide.
Yeah.
There's also really lovely work from 1887 by a Chilean artist who actually did it was like a public art commission in Times Square where he rented an LED screen that had a map of the United States and a flag of the United States where it said, "This is not America's map, this is not America's flag," which I think was very much pointing to the same thing. Something that was kind of endless repetition of American amnesia, something that I kept being struck by, especially even how quickly history moves now, that since we started working on the show not that long ago, so much has happened, is that sometimes you have this feeling that nothing has changed, right? That you're kind of living these same struggles. And something that I also thought was interesting and kind of thinking about how we think of borders and migration policy here in the country, that of course Europe has its own version and it's all interconnected and it's all, has its roots in similar places, but it's experienced different. That there's just this feeling of, that there's this repetition that we're not learning from the past, that it keeps kind of endlessly repeating. And that's something that I think sometimes your work has that ambiguity about if it's an ultimately hopeful message, which of course, this is life, so there is no answer of it being a happy ending or not. It's just like lived experience. But I think that some of your works, like the Crucero del Norte, I think it does have a glimmer, a literal light, a literal glimmer of hope that I think is a really kind of lovely thing.
That's a hard question. I have to say, it's not, I think that, I'm not sure if I think so much in those terms about the work, but I think that they include questions of hope and and negotiations in a much broader way that some people read, and I think also there is also a possibility of humor, for example, like here, for example, that's not so often narrated into the work. But I think also I believe, or I hope and I trust and I negotiate the possibility to dialogue with the viewer. No? So I have this kind of, I think that I let the works also have this kind of space where I try to meet the audience, not by defining what they see, but letting them also enter a discussion in a way, almost be something kind of in between the images, no? And also letting that space be a space for dialogue and struggle, I would say.
So a decision that you made, Runo, is that you're interested in showing quipus from the permanent collection. So these are objects from the Incan Empire from the 15th, 16th century that very little is known about. But we know that they're extremely complicated, and it's actually interesting because there's kind of, I feel like, an intense moment of study right now of quipus, which are complex kind of administrative markers that we know that all of these various aspects of them have significance, but we don't know exactly what the significance is. Of course, this was a casualty to history that after Spanish colonialism and after the moment of contact, we kind of lost what these things meant. But it's kind of exciting in a way that we're learning more about them. I think there's graduate students in Harvard who are in data science who are figuring out some of the significance here. So there's things like, these are knotted fabrics. These are knotted kind of fiber works where there's 3 different types of knots, and the lengths of knots have meaning, and the space between the knots have meaning, and the color of threads have meaning, and they were just keeping track of these really like intensely complicated like tax records and censorship figures, and we're just now learning what they mean. And so Runo decided to hang these in the same room as the American Amnesia. So again, even though there is amnesia, there's also reclamation, and I think that that's like a really poignant thought as well.
Yeah, because I think what it was interesting to do, when you do an exhibition in a museum that has a collection, you can also play like a museum. A museum it doesn't only present to the world; it also creates the world. No, I think that like also if you look at historically, the big European museums like the Louvre and the Prado, like they were also created in a very specific time. No, they were like these countries were producing. They were like. They were creating their own like national states, no? And they needed a museum. They needed these spaces to become a national state, to create a narrative about national state. And that also inquires a discussion of a definition of something outside that state, no? The other, no? Like if you talk about in more philosophical terms, no? So I think also so it's always interesting the way when you enter a museum to see how this kind of categorization works, no? I think, and to then also that's when to move the quipos, no, from one entity of the museum to another, I think can give you a glimpse of that, or break a bit this kind of categorizations of history and categorizations of time and space, no? That I think is an important part. No? The other one which you can kind of play if you want to be less hopeful is like to the idea of like, no, but also like any kind of any space of language is a space for struggle, no? And you have to in different ways negotiate that struggle. I think that, and the quipos for a long time were unclear what it was, and they were like almost looked as just like this kind of aesthetically beautiful things, which of course they are, but they also now we start to understand that also they had like a very, they meant something, that they produced a language. So in that sense, here I think that maybe the ways we can translate it, it's not like the Italian saying, like the translator is a traitor, which is a very famous Italian saying, but on the contrary, it's a way of trying to give it space, to give it like to embody its own history in a way.
Do you want to talk about these other beautiful slides there about violent corner? So this is another aspect of kind of this intervention into a museum collection.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we took those in because I think this is another example of the other work. The other work was to take like one historical artifacts into the contemporary. But here it's a project which is called Violent Corners, which is an older work of mine from I think 2014-15, which is in a very simple. It's a very simple piece, which is just like what I made, like in an institution or a gallery, all the 4 corners of the space. I think there is one without this institution. They have like golden corners, it's like they have like the. So, like you see here to the left now. So all this. So what I did is like all the corners of the space are golden, no? Like with golden leaves, no? And I think it has this reference to kind of minimalist art, like the corner pieces and the kind of the Dan Flyvid corners, but also here, what I did is this is in LACMA, no? In their collection. In the Americas collection, in the colonial collection. So in a way, what I did here, I made, like in a way, I putting the gold and the violent corners in the collection was a way of giving the audience like a way, or like a hint to think, okay, what are these paintings about? What are these sculptures about? What was the negotiation between the crossing of the Atlantic, no? The exchange, or the very violent exchange between gold and goods, between like gold and slavery. So I think this is kind of like another way of dealing with similar question, but you, instead of adding to moving out, here is an example of adding into the museum structure. Another thing which I like here, I think, is yet this idea of that an audience that goes to this room in the museum doesn't expect that there will be like a contemporary intervention in the room. Like in a way, they have they left their guard, I think. So I think that's also a way of how you can destabilize the viewer, because they go here to see the collection. They go here to see the way like Spaniards and Portugal produced image of its colonies, and then suddenly you have this like gold intervention.
Maybe actually I'll show the kintsugi. Oh, there. Sorry, we did have it.
That's the example. Yeah.
I'm going to show the kintsugi, and then maybe we can show the video after that.
Do you?
Just because the golden kind of joinery in a way, which is interesting, I hadn't made this connection. So this is the newest work in the show, which is now in our museum collection. Very beautifully installed in this space. So this is a series called When Gold Was King, and Runo used the kintsugi technique on these found ceramics. So kintsugi is a traditional Japanese technique where they would take broken ceramics, sometimes historical objects, not always contemporary works, and they would use golden leaf to repair the objects. So it's a way to kind of honor history, honor breakage, honor the passage of time. I think that it has also a lot of ambiguity ultimately to the meaning. And for me, I think another moment where I really wanted this to be like a hopeful moment, I was thinking in terms of our own history, and what I do love about so much about Runo's work is that it is speaking, of course, on all of this history that I've been mentioning that I'm interested in, kind of Latin American modernism and those like specific discourses, but that these ideas are so universal. So I'm thinking about our own moments in the US where we're trying to think of our history of Confederate monuments per se, and how do we honor past histories that are very traumatic for people, or not honor them, but deal with them, and how can we create art or create imagery that points to pain but also points to something in the future. So I read this as a very hopeful work when I first read it, and then in conversations I also totally missed this really interesting specific references to the very kind of nature of the transatlantic slave trade, which Runo was directly referencing. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the things that you were thinking about in making this work.
No, but I think but in Swedish, there's this word called läka, which means healing. But you can also like for me, like I play with the idea of like läkning, the linking and the linking. The linking and the linking, they're the same words they're like the U.S. language. So like for me, I think it started from that. And then of course there is a way of healing, of linking, like a past. When something breaks, you kind of you try to put it together, still showing its fractions. I think that's a very important. I think for me, like in works, but also in that life, like this kind of, not the purity, there's not such thing as a kind of an essence, but to show the failures and the fractions. I think, of course, here it's very clear that they're broken and then they're put together, which in some way creates a story of it creates a narrative of these plates, and that's the narrative of the lost. I think. At the same time, another aspect of which I was thinking, like there was this kind of idea of the blue as a reference of the ocean, like as the water. And the exchange that the Atlantic water produced of gold, suddenly the Atlantic became, like in a way, the first production of capitalism. In a way, they started to produce like the gold was transported on the ocean to first the African slave were shipped to America. And then that produced, and the gold was shipped not back to Africa, but to Europe. No? So in a way, it was also this kind of playing with those questions. But at the same time, I think also very important for me, this all these questions are there in some way, but at the same time, they're also very simple objects, like everyday objects of being plates, or the other ones are school maps or stamps. So to have this kind of level of abstraction, but also everyday life, I think is important in the work.
And one of the plates, which several people who are unpacking have noticed, is an IKEA plate. And there was this moment of familiarity of, I have that plate. And we looked around, we couldn't believe it. We're like, this is an IKEA plate. Which, of course, wow. IKEA comes from Sweden, so I thought that was awesome in a way, incorporating, of course, what we think of capitalism in Sweden is your greatest export.
Yeah, it's one of the greatest exports. Absolutely.
But yeah, this familiarity, I think, is really important. The kind of the idea of these objects that we all live with, I think is super nice. I would love to show the video, and then maybe we can open it up to questions.
I think we can continue talking. I think that
you want to explain what's happening?
Yeah, I can do it. I think you're capable of doing both things. So this is a video I made in 2017. And what you see here, is these are eggs and being unpacked that I bought in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. So it's like 12 normal eggs. And of course, eggs have extremely many symbolic, not only religious, but also within art history, like Marcel Botares. But they have all this kind of. But what I did with these eggs, I bought them in Argentina, also because Argentina is a place where my parents come from. And then.
This is your father.
Exactly. So the person to the right, that's my father, and that's me, a younger version. Me. So what I did, so I managed, after some quite difficulties, to transport these eggs from Argentina to Sao Paulo, where I was living, and then to Sevilla, this is Sevilla in Spain. And I think even if it's not, you cannot see that. But for me, as a kind of both as a kind of an intellectual, but also as a conceptual part of the work, it's very important that it is those eggs. That they came from Argentina. They did all this extremely complicated travel. Because eggs are very fragile, and it's an organic thing which makes them illegal to transport. And then, as you can see, and you will see, that monument there, this horrendous monument, is made by a Georgian-Russian artist called Satsurelli, and it's Christopher Columbus inside an egg. So it's like 32 meters high. So it's like a very ugly mix between Baroque and Stalinism, I think. And why it's Columbus in an egg? It's because there is this story that they were in a bar, or Columbus was in a bar, and they were trying to put an egg on a table. And if you try, it's very difficult to have it standing. But then what Columbus did, he just cracked it, and then it stays. So I mean, I think it's an analogy of now that everybody knows that the world is round, it's really easy to travel. But when he crossed, nobody knew. So that's the kind of the. So, and this monument was made in '92 for the Expo Sevilla.
Which was the 500th anniversary of the founding.
Exactly. Of America discovery. So what we do, we just, you will see we just throw the eggs on the monument. That's a very. My father was very happy about this, actually, I have to say. But also, but I think also one important thing here, I mean, that a lot of, that a lot of people has asked me if I see this as kind of like a kind of activistic position, which I don't. I see it, there's things I think sees very much like kind of symbolic thing, and a kind of also a grand gesture with a lot of pathetic involvement, because it was such an effort to move this eggs to Spain, and then you just do this, and I think that kind of that position, I think it's an important space. There was enough of complications, can I tell you? But.
We can start opening up for questions, and then if it's awkward silence, I'll just keep talking.
Yeah.
We have more slides if it's really awkward.
Exactly.
Any questions?
Comments? Critiques?
I have a question. So in the work with the plates that are being repaired with the gold, obviously the gold is in a liquid form when you're pouring and repairing it. And so were you at all contemplating how a lot of the gold that the Spanish were bringing back from the Americas was being melted down from its original form and then transformed into something else? I mean, just the process of it being that liquid, and were you thinking about that at all?
No, actually not, because I could have said yes, because it's a very good narrative, I think. No, we tried different liquids, of course, because there was a way of like technically doing it. But I think that you're right in the way of like that. A lot of the gold became something else. It became another material, which is something very interesting. Like, which also means that means that in a kind of historical sense, a lot of the knowledge production disappeared because it became European material instead of necklace or other things. So there is a disappearance of knowledge there, which is really interesting, I would say.
Related to the considering, I was wondering, so you bring up this idea that you were thinking about like the transactions that were taking place across the Atlantic, but I was wondering if you, because this is like a Japanese technique and this is the way in which you're rehearsing those ideas, if you were thinking about the transactions that were also taking place across the Pacific, because I feel like even in our collection we have, I think, like a 17th or 18th century chest that is a Spanish chest, but it makes use of this inlaid mother of pearl technique that is taken very much from like Korean and Chinese artistic traditions. And for the longest time we thought that had come like to Spain from South America, but actually now we're thinking maybe it was from the Philippines, and it's like, it's sort of, so you know, those global interactions have been present throughout history, even like with the Silk Road, how, you know, people were trading things and then taking them across the Pacific as well as the Atlantic. So I was wondering if there was any like substance to you choosing a Japanese medium.
I think that I agree with the. I think that what we learn that many critics have said like the last 20 years, especially kind of like if you look at the idea of like a global South as a kind of not as a geographical space, but as a kind of a political entity, which I think that kind of gives us the idea of that there's been a lot of dialogues and commerce and exchange for much longer than the West or the hegemonic narration, or what we learn in school. I think like Philippines is, of course, but that's so much connected to a Spanish colonial history. So I think in that sense, I think it is important. Me specifically using this technique in this work, I didn't relate so much to that connection between the Pacific, but I related much more to the idea of like the possibilities of narrating idea of breaking and closure, or like of linking, I think, for me. But I think for me, more like what I have been doing a lot, which is not so much emphasis here, but I've been looking a lot about the Mediterranean as that space. Especially now, if you look at contemporary European politics, that it so clearly is trying to close its borders, especially against Africa, but not only, and also how the European is trying to construct an identity from the antique, being antique, Rome, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and now European Union. Like, of course, this is like a very simple way of narrating it, but and so I've been looking a lot about the Mediterranean as this space of multitude narratives and multitudes exchange. That and like to see how this, how that also in our contemporary life has so much been erased of a European kind of xenophobic history.
You said early on a list of some of the places that you have shown your work, and I didn't get all of them, but I did get the Guggenheim and the larger show. And then also, you mentioned this kind of multi-parts to this question, that we have some pieces of already in our collection, and that his work will be added to it. Mm-hmm. So my question is where would you, do you have a particular places or geographical places that you would like to show your work? I mean, if you could name, would it be China? Would it be New York? Is there some audience that you think it would have particular resonance with in the world?
I think it's a good question. And first I was like, oh, that's like a, but I think it's. First, you can say it in a very, not bad, but of course, it's if you live in Sweden, which I do most of the year, and it's February and it's like 20 minus and snow, it's fantastic if somebody invites you to go to Madagascar, for example, because that's more for like a personal survivor. But I think that I don't know a specific place, but what I think it's important and that's the idea of like how you unlearn and you still learn is when you start to show works in many different places. It's also the same work, which happens to me a lot. The works are they're interpreted very different. Because of course every space or every region has its own relation to these questions or its own history, and in that sense, for me, it's been very important. For example, this piece which I made, which is called "If You Don't Know What the South Is, It's Simply Because You're from the North," no? which
You've shown probably maybe the most places, or what would you say?
this is a piece it's been shown many times.
So this is one iteration in New Orleans for Prospect 4. So this was done on the water in a kind of industrial gentrified park area. So this is in a billboard form, but it also takes different forms like poster stacks.
Yeah.
And this form, which I love.
This is an airport in Sweden.
So this is the conveyor belt that I showed in Sweden.
So, but this is a good example because the South, like for me, like when I do produce the work, like I was so much thinking of the South, of the global South, of Latin America and as the South in relation to this kind of discourse of North and South, of like this idea of the first or the, like all this kind of very problematic categorizations, of South and North, and which are. But at the same time, when I showed it in New Orleans, their idea of South and North is completely different. So in another way, they were completely flipped for me. So in that sense, I don't know. I don't have an answer of where I want to show my work, but I think that it's very important as an artist to be open to how our works can change, how the works they're not static. Every time you show it in a different context, they will be interpreted in a different way. And for me, it's also, and for me at least, you have to let that be there, let that happen, and see what happens. Don't try to define already what it is, because first I think it's impossible, but then I think also one of the fantastic things of being an artist is the dialogue with other people, but also to other places, and to see what happens in that context.
What's your daily practice like? Has it evolved in terms of the amount of material you experiment with, or do you work from a studio or office, and do you work nomadically?
No, my everyday life, I have a studio, and I kind of go to the studio, but I think that one, like if you look at it, like I think one thing that changed, like maybe not drastically, but at least was very important for me was when I, in a way, like when I started to much closer look to kind of Latin American conceptual art, like the one that you, because I'm trained in Sweden, so though you don't read. Like your art history is so much connected to kind of Western conceptual art, or one part of the Western. But I think what I also saw that and kind of also influenced me a lot was this kind of a much more clear discussion with what materiality can be and what it can narrate, and how you can move that discussion, which I think is very present in the Latin American conceptual history. But then to my everyday life, like I don't, just like I have, I go to the studio at 9 and kind of try to work to 5. Like that's so boring. It's like a quite, of course for many years I did a lot of like residency, like in different places and kind of and like in different countries, but my everyday life, I go to the studio and I try to, and there is moments which of course it's very full with kind of bureaucratical production, and when you go to production, I usually work with other people, like try to, like different people can help me produce different things, but otherwise it's like kind of studio based in a way,
I think there is a practicality of traveling a lot that has probably influenced your practice. And you got postcards delivered to the museum that you presumably ordered somewhere else that got delivered here that will then go somewhere else. And we were at the warehouse today and saw on Carwa's date paintings. I think we also had this moment about, like, how did he make these? Were these, like, did he carry these around already stretched because he made them every day, everywhere he went? I think it is kind of interesting to think about those like practical matters that seem boring. But
no, I agree, and I think also I think that when I did a lot of these works that deals with placement or displacement also are based on this idea of that I didn't have a clear, maybe not so much an identity, but I didn't exactly knew where I was living. So then like also a lot of works became produced in this kind of nomadic way, or like, okay, I will travel here. What is this travel about? Why I'm going to Argentina? Why I'm going there? And in a way, kind of incorporated all that in the production of works. Like then, of course, you didn't have a studio because you were traveling too much. So I think it's, so also I think it's those kind of things that are very boring everyday life, of course, influence the way you produce a lot, I think also. They're not only parentheses, I'd say. You had a question, no? Yeah? Yeah.
It seems like we could connect the maps and those broken pieces because, sort of a continental drift thing, they go apart, we pull them back together, they fit a certain way, and then these crazy borders, it just
Yeah, no, I was
seems
thinking
like
the
there's
same thing
some
with
sort
the
of
cracks,
connection
yeah.
there that they're just lines that, what do they mean?
Yeah.
It's true, it's a beautiful.
It's very
Beautiful
poetic. I think,
poetic
a lot.
connection.
Thank you.
I was just curious if you always use English or you also use Portuguese and Spanish.
Not so much Portuguese, because it's not my. No, actually, not Swedish. Like maybe when I studied, I used some Swedish, but I think also like when you study art in Sweden, it's like predominantly it's a production in English. You do like the schools, because you have so many international teachers, and you also have a lot of international students. But I give classes like in Stockholm, and then like most of the classes are in English. Of course, if there is a Swedish student and you do studio visit with that person, you do it in Swedish. But like in the collective, I do. But I've used Spanish in titles and some Portuguese, but very little Portuguese because I'm very unsure about Portuguese. It's not my language in that sense. But I used like Spanish, like in titles, yes, like Crucero del Norte or Contratiempos, for example, are used in.
And our subtitles, EntreMundos.
EntreMundos, exactly. Titles.
Yeah.
Have you spent enough time thinking about all the languages that are involved in your production? Your wife is an Argentine Brazilian who teaches in English in Copenhagen and is teaching your son Portuguese. I heard them speaking predominantly in Portuguese.
Yeah.
It's very multi-linguistic. Well, I think we've crept up on 8 o'clock. Thank you guys for being here so late and for joining us.
Thank you.